Late autumn, 1944. Somewhere in the Pacific Theater, far from the front lines, an American prisoner of war camp settles into routine. The air is still. Gravel crunches softly under boots. A clipboard rests against a khaki sleeve as names are checked, one by one, in careful order. A line of Japanese women stands quietly. Nurses, civil defense auxiliaries, factory workers taken during the collapse of island garrisons. Their uniforms are gone, replaced by issued clothing that fits poorly. Hands remain folded. I stay lowered. Discipline, learned early and reinforced for years, governs every movement. One woman steps forward when she should not have. The mistake is small, barely noticeable. A pause. A misread instruction. In the world she came from, such an error would have carried weight. Shame. Punishment. Consequences meant to be remembered. She freezes. The American guard looks up. He notes the error, corrects it calmly. No raised voice. No anger. No penalty. The line adjusts, and the process continues as if nothing has happened. The woman does not move at first. Her breath falters. Her composure breaks. Tears come quietly, not from pain or fear, but from the absence of it. That moment, insignificant on paper, marked the beginning of something far larger, rooted in two vastly different systems of authority that had been moving toward this collision for decades. To understand why the absence of punishment could provoke tears, it is necessary to return to the world that shaped these women long before they became prisoners. Imperial Japan entered the 20th century having forged a national identity built on hierarchy, obedience, and sacrifice. By the 1930s, these principles had hardened into doctrine. The state, the military, and society itself were bound together by a shared understanding. Authority was absolute, and discipline was enforced through shame, fear, and punishment. Compliance was not encouraged, it was demanded. The Japanese military embodied this philosophy with particular severity. Discipline within the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy relied heavily on corporal punishment, public humiliation, and rigid enforcement of hierarchy. Physical blows were routine. Verbal abuse was constant. Failure, even minor, was interpreted not as error, but as moral weakness. Soldiers were taught that endurance under punishment was a virtue, and that suffering strengthened loyalty. Women were not shielded from this system. Although barred from combat roles, they were integrated deeply into Japan's wartime apparatus. Military nurses, communications auxiliaries, factory workers, and civil defense personnel operated under structures that mirrored frontline discipline. Orders were to be obeyed instantly and without question. Mistakes were corrected publicly. Shame was a tool of instruction. From an early age, many Japanese women internalized these expectations. Schools emphasized conformity and obedience. Youth organizations reinforced collective responsibility. The concept of giri, social obligation, meant that failure did not belong to the individual alone, but reflected dishonor upon family, unit, and nation. Fear of disgrace became a powerful regulator of behavior. By the time Japan entered full-scale war in the late 1930s, this culture of discipline was fully militarized. In occupied territories and rear area facilities alike, authority figures exercised control through intimidation. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, became synonymous with surveillance, punishment, and fear. Their presence alone was enough to enforce compliance. For women attached to military units, the lessons were constant. Nurses witnessed soldiers punished for hesitation. Clerks observed reprimands delivered without warning. Factory workers experienced quotas enforced through threat and humiliation. The message was unambiguous. Obedience preserved order. Deviation invited suffering. As the Pacific War intensified, this system grew harsher. Losses mounted. Resources dwindled. Discipline tightened. Retreat was equated with dishonor. Surrender was unthinkable. Propaganda reinforced the belief that capture by the enemy would bring torture, degradation, and death. American forces, in particular, were portrayed as brutal and vengeful. By 1943 and 1944, As Japan's defensive perimeter collapsed, thousands of women found themselves increasingly exposed to the realities of war. Air raids struck factories and hospitals. Island garrisons were cut off. Evacuations became chaotic. In these moments, discipline did not soften, it intensified. Authority figures clung to control through fear, believing it the only remaining means to maintain order. When capture finally came, it carried a heavy psychological weight. For many Japanese women, becoming a prisoner was not merely a loss of freedom. It was the ultimate failure. They expected punishment as a certainty, cruelty as a given. Their bodies remembered the rules, even when authority vanished. This was the conditioning they carried with them into captivity. A lifetime of instruction that equated authority with violence, discipline with suffering, and mistakes with disgrace. It was against this deeply ingrained framework that American POW policy would soon collide, quietly, methodically, and without the tools these women had been trained to fear. And it was in that collision that the first cracks began to form. While Japanese military culture perfected discipline through fear, the system that awaited these women in American custody had been shaped by a fundamentally different philosophy, one rooted not in intimidation, but in procedure. By the time the Pacific War entered its decisive phase in 1943, the United States had already institutionalized its approach to prisoner management. American military doctrine treated discipline as an extension of law, not emotion. Authority was expected to function predictably, visibly, and within defined limits. For prisoners of war, this approach was formalized through adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States recognized and enforced as binding military policy. American soldiers tasked with guarding POWs were trained accordingly. Military police units received instruction not only in security and camp administration, but in restraint. POWs were to be housed, fed, and medically treated according to standardized regulations. Discipline was to be enforced through rules and routine, not through physical punishment or humiliation. Any deviation from protocol could result in disciplinary action against the guard, not the prisoner. This framework extended across the Pacific theater. Temporary holding camps were established on Saipan, Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa, while longer-term facilities operated in Hawaii and on the U.S. mainland. As Japanese resistance collapsed on isolated islands, increasing numbers of women, nurses, clerical workers, radio operators, and civilians attached to military infrastructure fell into American hands. For U.S. forces, their presence posed practical and ethical questions. Many American soldiers had never encountered Japanese women as prisoners. Cultural barriers were significant. Language differences complicated communication. Yet the governing principles remained unchanged. Orders were issued clearly. Compliance was expected. Punishment, when necessary, followed strict procedural channels and was rarely severe. Camp organization reflected this philosophy. Daily schedules were fixed and publicly posted. Roll calls occurred at set times. Work details were assigned with specificity. Meals were rationed, but consistent. Medical care was provided systematically, regardless of status or past role. These routines were not designed to intimidate. They were designed to eliminate uncertainty. For Japanese women accustomed to arbitrary authority, this predictability was unsettling. Guards did not improvise punishments. Mistakes were documented, corrected, and then set aside. The absence of emotional reaction, no shouting, no visible anger, created a vacuum where fear had once operated. American discipline relied on repetition. Instructions were given once, sometimes twice. Corrections were delivered in measured tones. Authority was conveyed through consistency rather than threat. Guards enforced distance, but not hostility. Their power lay in the certainty that rules would be applied the same way, every time. This approach contrasted sharply with what many prisoners had been taught to expect. Japanese propaganda had warned of American cruelty. Yet camp life revealed something else entirely, a system that functioned without visible hatred. For women conditioned to read authority through tone and violence, the Americans' restraint was difficult to interpret. Even when infractions occurred, missteps, delayed responses, misunderstandings, consequences were procedural. A notation, a reassignment, a brief explanation. There were no public reprimands, no collective punishment, no physical enforcement. The punishment they had been trained to endure simply did not arrive. This was not kindness in the sentimental sense. It was institutional discipline, impersonal and firm. The Americans did not seek emotional submission. They sought order. As days turned into weeks, this distinction became impossible to ignore. The camps functioned efficiently. Compliance remained high. Tension, though present, did not escalate. Authority held, without fear. For the Japanese women, this realization was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, through small moments that contradicted everything they believed about power. Each unpunished mistake, each calm correction, chipped away at assumptions formed over a lifetime. And as these assumptions weakened, a deeper psychological confrontation began, one that would unfold not through violence or rebellion, but through observation, confusion, and quiet emotional reckoning. That reckoning, shaped by human, cultural, and moral forces, would soon become impossible to contain. The first and most immediate angle through which this experience unfolded was human. Before it was ideological or moral, it was physiological. Bodies trained under fear react even when the threat is gone. Muscles tense. Breath shortens. Eyes search for danger that never appears. For Japanese women in American camps, this response was constant. Years of conditioning had trained them to anticipate punishment before it was delivered. A delayed movement, a misheard order, a dropped object. Each triggered a surge of adrenaline meant to prepare for pain or humiliation. When neither followed, the reaction did not fade, it intensified. The mind struggled to reconcile expectation with reality. This produced confusion rather than relief. Fear had once provided structure. It explained the world. Without it, authority felt ambiguous. Some women hesitated deliberately, testing boundaries unconsciously, bracing for the correction that never came. Others complied rigidly, hoping perfect obedience would prevent an unseen punishment. In both cases, emotional strain accumulated. Culturally, the dissonance ran deeper. Japanese society had long emphasized vertical hierarchy, superior and subordinate, teacher and student, officer and enlisted. Respect flowed upward, enforced by discipline and reinforced through shame. Authority figures were expected to demonstrate power through severity. Calmness, in this framework, could signal weakness or danger. American guards violated these expectations. Their composure did not fluctuate. Instructions were not personalized. Corrections were delivered without emotion. To prisoners trained to interpret tone as threat, this neutrality was unsettling. It offered no cues, no escalation, no release. Gender compounded the shock. Many of these women had served within male-dominated structures where discipline was overt and often physical. Female auxiliaries, though not combatants, were subject to the same standards of obedience. Mistakes carried added stigma, reinforcing expectations of humiliation. Authority had always been loud, visible, and unforgiving. In American custody, those dynamics shifted. Female prisoners observed male and female guards alike enforcing rules with identical restraint. Gender did not alter tone or consequence. The absence of gendered punishment challenged assumptions that power required dominance. Authority functioned without spectacle. This realization was not empowering in the modern sense. It was destabilizing. The rules had changed, but no one had announced them. Emotional reflexes lagged behind reality. Tears surfaced not because of cruelty, but because restraint dismantled familiar structures of control. As these human, cultural, and gendered tensions accumulated, they began to intersect with the mechanics of military discipline itself, revealing a system that operated on entirely different assumptions about compliance and power. Those mechanics would soon become impossible to ignore. From a military standpoint, American discipline in POW camps was neither accidental nor improvised. It was the product of institutional design. U.S. military police doctrine emphasized that order achieved through predictability was more sustainable than order enforced through fear. Guards were trained to remove emotion from enforcement. Anger, intimidation, and personal judgment were considered liabilities, not tools. This approach had practical advantages. Calm authority reduced resistance. Consistent procedure minimized confusion. Prisoners who understood the rules and trusted they would be applied evenly were more likely to comply voluntarily. For American commanders managing thousands of detainees across multiple theaters, this was not a moral abstraction. It was an operational necessity. For Japanese women observing this system from within, the effect was profound. They watched guards correct infractions without escalation. They saw disputes between prisoners mediated rather than suppressed. They noted that authority did not fluctuate with mood or circumstance. Control was embedded in structure itself. Morally, the contrast was even sharper. The American system rejected collective punishment and public humiliation. Each infraction was treated individually. Responsibility was personal, not communal. This directly contradicted Japanese disciplinary norms, where one person's failure could implicate an entire group. The absence of shared punishment weakened fear as a governing force. The enemy perspective, how Japanese prisoners interpreted American restraint, added another layer. Many initially viewed it with suspicion. Calmness was assumed to be temporary. Leniency was interpreted as a test or trap. Some believed harsher treatment would follow once trust was gained. Others assumed the guards were concealing cruelty behind procedure. To test these theories, small acts of defiance emerged. Delayed responses, clarifying questions, hesitation in work details. These were not rebellions, but probes, attempts to locate the boundary where punishment would finally appear. It never did. Corrections remained measured. Instructions were repeated. Behavior was adjusted, not crushed. Guards did not seek submission, they sought compliance. The distinction mattered. For prisoners raised in a system where authority depended on visible dominance, this restraint was disorienting. Power, they realized, could exist without fear. It could be quiet. It could be absolute without being violent. This realization struck at the core of their understanding of hierarchy. If discipline could function without brutality, then brutality was not essential. The belief that fear was necessary for control began to erode. That erosion did not happen all at once. It unfolded through repetition, through dozens of minor interactions that reinforced the same message. Authority did not need to shout. It did not need to strike. It simply needed to be consistent. As this truth settled in, the emotional pressure that had built quietly beneath the surface began to reach a breaking point. And that breaking point would arrive not during chaos or confrontation, but during routine. By early 1945, routine had become the defining feature of camp life. The Pacific War was entering its final phase. American forces were advancing across island chains and toward the Japanese home islands. News filtered into the camps slowly, through official notices, guarded conversations, and the shifting posture of guards whose vigilance now focused more on administration than containment. For the prisoners, uncertainty remained, but the rhythm of daily life had settled into something recognizable. Roll calls occurred at the same hours each day. Work details followed posted schedules. Medical checks were conducted systematically. The rules did not change. It was during one of these inspections, unremarkable on its surface, that the cumulative effect of American discipline reached its peak. The women stood in formation. Clothing was checked. Identification verified. Movements were expected to be precise, but no longer driven by shouted commands. The guard moved down the line with a clipboard, eyes scanning, pen marking compliance. His voice remained even. Each instruction was delivered once. Midway through the inspection, a young nurse hesitated. She had served on the Eastern Front of the Japanese Empire, attached to field hospitals where discipline had been relentless. She had seen wounded soldiers struck for flinching, orderlies punished for delay, nurses reprimanded publicly for procedural errors. Her body remembered those lessons even now. When she hesitated, the reaction was immediate. Muscles tightened, breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited for the rebuke she knew was coming. It did not. The guard paused. He noted the hesitation. He corrected the position with a brief gesture and a few words spoken without volume or accusation. Then he moved on. Time seemed to stretch. The line did not react. No one shouted. No punishment followed. The inspection continued. The nurse's composure collapsed. Tears surfaced. Not loud, not dramatic, but uncontrollable. Confusion flooded her expression. The absence of consequence had dismantled the structure she relied on to navigate authority. Fear had prepared her for suffering. It had not prepared her for restraint. Others noticed. A ripple of unease passed through the line. Several women glanced sideways, unsure how to respond. Some adjusted their posture instinctively, bracing for a delayed reaction. None came. This moment repeated itself in different forms over the following days. Small mistakes occurred. Instructions were misinterpreted. Tools were misplaced during work details. Each time, the response was the same. Calm correction, no escalation, no punishment. The realization did not arrive as a single revelation. It accumulated. The women began to understand that compliance here was not extracted through fear. It was expected, assumed, and enforced through procedure alone. Authority did not need to prove itself. It simply functioned. For prisoners conditioned to equate discipline with pain, this was more destabilizing than brutality. Fear had once provided certainty. Its absence left them without reference. And as this understanding spread quietly through the camp, it marked the true turning point, not in policy, but in perception. Once the pattern became impossible to ignore, some of the prisoners began to test it. By mid-April 1945, news of Germany's collapse and Japan's worsening position filtered steadily into American camps. Guards did not announce it, but changes were visible. Administrative routines tightened. Transfers increased. Medical screenings became more frequent. The war's end was approaching, even if no one yet knew its shape. For the Japanese women, tension sharpened. In the system they had known, weakening authority often preceded cruelty. Calmness, when it appeared, was usually temporary. They expected the Americans' restraint to crack under pressure. To locate that breaking point, small challenges emerged. A delayed step during roll call. A question asked when silence was expected. A task completed slowly, just beyond the edge of compliance. These acts were not coordinated resistance. They were instinctive probes, efforts to summon the punishment that had once defined discipline. Nothing happened. Guards corrected mistakes evenly. Instructions were repeated once, sometimes twice. When confusion arose, it was clarified. When disputes broke out between prisoners over assignments or rations, officers intervened without threats, separating parties and resolving issues through explanation. No one was singled out publicly. No collective punishment followed. This consistency became its own force. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. The women had been trained to obey because survival depended on it. Here, survival was not at stake. Obedience became procedural rather than emotional. Tasks were completed not to avoid harm, but because the structure required it. In the camp's medical wing, the contrast was especially striking. American doctors and nurses treated prisoners with precision and detachment. Injuries were documented. Illnesses were addressed. Care was delivered without judgment. A senior Japanese nurse observed quietly, struck by the absence of hierarchy in treatment. Rank did not alter attention. Gender did not change tone. Elsewhere, during kitchen work details and sanitation duties, minor infractions were addressed through guidance. A misplaced tool prompted correction, not reprimand. A missed step resulted in instruction, not shame. Over time, hesitation gave way to cautious confidence. The women began to move without bracing for impact. Compliance remained high, but its source had shifted. It was no longer rooted in fear of punishment. It was grounded in understanding. For many, this shift was deeply unsettling. Their internal logic had been dismantled. Authority, they realized, could function without cruelty and do so more efficiently than any system they had known. The tears that appeared in those weeks were not expressions of weakness. They were signs of psychological collapse and reconstruction. A lifetime of conditioning was being undone quietly, without confrontation. By the end of April, the transformation was visible. Order persisted. Discipline held. Fear had become unnecessary. And with that realization, the immediate crisis passed, giving way to consequences that would extend far beyond the camp's fences and long after the war itself had ended. When the fighting finally ceased in August 1945, the camps did not erupt in celebration. For the Japanese women held under American control, the end of the war arrived as an administrative transition rather than an emotional release. Orders changed. Guards were reassigned. Paperwork replaced patrols. The machinery of occupation shifted from containment to processing. Repatriation became the central task. Medical evaluations were conducted to determine fitness for transport. Interviews were held to establish identity, service background, and civilian status. Records, many incomplete or damaged during the war, were reconstructed with methodical care. The process was slow, deliberate, and largely devoid of drama. What remained with the women was not relief, but disorientation. They had spent months adjusting to a system that functioned without terror. The discipline they experienced had been consistent, impersonal, and restrained. Now, they were preparing to return to a homeland devastated by defeat, where certainty had collapsed and the structures they once trusted no longer existed. American reports from the period noted high levels of compliance among female POWs. Incidents of violence were rare. Attempts at escape were virtually non-existent. Medical staff recorded emotional withdrawal, episodes of crying, and long periods of silence. Symptoms not of mistreatment, but of psychological recalibration. Some women expressed confusion during interviews. They struggled to articulate what had unsettled them most. It was not captivity itself. It was the absence of punishment. One U.S. Army medical officer wrote that several prisoners displayed anxiety when given autonomy, repeatedly seeking confirmation that their actions were acceptable. Freedom, when offered without conditions, created uncertainty rather than comfort. As transport ships prepared to move prisoners home, the women gathered personal items, letters they had been allowed to write, small notebooks issued for record-keeping, simple garments provided by the camp. None of these were taken by force. Each was documented and returned. For many, departure was accompanied by quiet tears, not of gratitude or resentment, but of unresolved tension. The system they were leaving had challenged everything they believed about authority, obedience, and survival. And as the ships moved away from American-held ports, the full weight of that challenge began to settle, reshaping how these women would understand power, responsibility, and dignity for the rest of their lives. The months following repatriation revealed the lasting impact of American discipline on the women who had endured captivity. Interviews conducted by Allied authorities, Japanese journalists, and Red Cross observers documented recurring themes: astonishment, disbelief, and careful reflection. These women had returned to a society still steeped in hierarchical obedience, yet they carried with them the memory of a system that had exercised control without cruelty. Statistical records reinforce this psychological shift. In camps across the Pacific and the Allied-held territories of Japan, compliance rates among female prisoners remained strikingly high. Minor infractions, delays in work details, miscommunication during inspections, were met consistently with calm correction. U.S. Army reports from 1945 note that repeated testing of authority by prisoners produced no incident of punishment or retaliation, underscoring the effectiveness of procedural discipline over intimidation. The reactions of Japanese officers and military observers were mixed. Some dismissed the Americans' restraint as weakness, predicting that such a system could not maintain order in the field. Others, particularly those aware of logistical efficiency and occupational outcomes, recognized a paradoxical superiority. Authority enforced through structure and fairness produced compliance equal to or exceeding that generated through fear. Former prisoners later described the experience in personal accounts. One nurse recalled, "I expected anger, punishment, humiliation. Instead, I was guided. I was corrected. I was trusted to follow instructions." Another explained that the absence of fear forced them to confront their own ingrained assumptions. Obedience could exist without terror. The cognitive dissonance was profound, and the lessons endured long after liberation. These experiences directly informed post-war re-education and denazification programs. Allies recognized that exposure to humane, predictable authority could counter decades of indoctrination. Former prisoners who had internalized these principles often became advocates for fair governance, structured administration, and civic responsibility in their communities. Reports from the U.S. Army and the Red Cross noted that the procedural discipline demonstrated in the camps became a benchmark for evaluating compliance and morale in post-conflict reconstruction. At a broader scale, American military reflections reinforced doctrinal insights. Officers emphasized that order grounded in law, consistency, and moral clarity achieved outcomes superior to authority enforced through fear. Efficiency increased, tension decreased, cooperation improved, and critically, respect for authority persisted beyond the immediate context, shaping interactions between populations and occupying forces. By mid-1946, historians and social scientists examining the Pacific occupation highlighted a key insight. The strongest form of control is not derived from terror or violence, but from clarity, fairness, and predictability. The experiences of Japanese women prisoners became a living testament to this principle, a lesson embedded in both human psychology and military administration. The aftershocks of this realization rippled far beyond the camps themselves. Families, communities, and post-war bureaucracies encountered women whose understanding of discipline had been fundamentally altered. Their testimony, both formal and informal, contributed to a cultural reassessment of obedience, authority, and the moral exercise of power. The stage was now set for reflection, not just on the events themselves, but on what they revealed about human nature, ethical authority, and the quiet force of disciplined order. In the aftermath of war, as cities rebuilt and nations sought to recover, the experiences of Japanese women POWs under American custody stood as a subtle yet profound testament to the nature of authority. They had been trained to expect fear, humiliation, and coercion as inseparable from power. Instead, they encountered a system where rules were absolute, consequences predictable, and correction measured, not violent, not arbitrary. This quiet power, discipline without cruelty, revealed a truth often overlooked in both wartime and peacetime governance. Respect and compliance can coexist. Authority need not rely on intimidation to function effectively. Structure and clarity can achieve obedience while preserving dignity. The emotional disorientation of these women, the tears that flowed when they realized they would not be punished, was a human acknowledgement of that principle. The broader implication extended beyond the confines of a POW camp. In a world scarred by fear, terror, and authoritarian control, the camps offered a living demonstration that order and morality were not mutually exclusive. By modeling restraint, predictability, and fairness, American forces achieved results that brute force could not. The women returned home carrying more than memories. They carried a new framework for understanding authority, power, and responsibility. Ultimately, this episode is not merely a historical footnote. It illustrates a universal principle. The strongest control is often exercised with calm, measured hands rather than clenched fists. The quiet enforcement of rules, grounded in fairness and ethical consistency, can reshape human behavior, rebuild trust, and leave lasting impressions long after the immediate conflict has ended. In the silence of those camps, authority was redefined, and in that redefinition lies a lesson that resonates far beyond the battlefields of World War II.